Thanks for coming along. How nice to see you all. This is James Cahill, who has written a magnificent novel called The Violent Hour. Though there is violence in it, emotional and real. And it's set in the extraordinary modern world of art. And so we're going to have a conversation about the book, but also about the art world and about modern art and about how the public sees it, what we feel about modern art, whether we're being taken for a ride and whether our lack of confidence in modern art says more about us or more about the art world, and whether art is possible in our new environment of technology. But there's lots to get through, and maybe we should start with the reading, if you're happy to do it, and introduce it. And
I'd love to. Thanks, Stephen. Yes, I mean, The Violet Hour, I should just say, is my second novel, and unlike my first, which was set very much in one place and one time, this goes all over the world: Switzerland, New York, Hong Kong at one point. It's about the art world, so it needs to go everywhere. But it starts very specifically on a summer afternoon in London. The evening was so still that it could have been a picture. If anyone had been watching from the neighbouring tower block, the scene might have resembled a panoramic painting, a modern-day Bruegel, only without the people, or the final shot of a film: the deserted road below, the treetops and roofs, the dome of the Imperial War Museum, the sky turning lilac. Evening sunlight was catching the edges of things. A terrace of 1970s houses receded along one side of the road, meeting the vertical form of a Victorian water tower. Close to the top was a steel balcony, its outer corner a triangle of light. A young man appeared on the balcony, disturbing the illusion. His lips motioned a phrase, as though he were addressing someone through the door. Stepping back, he glanced at the sky. Then he spread his hands on the railings and drew his body upwards, sitting on the ledge. Sunlight struck his face and the blank of his t-shirt. Everything was still again, without even a breeze to animate the plane trees on the road. Then, abruptly, he toppled back, his body separating from the building. His trainers scissored above him. The sunlight had retreated from the patch of ground where he landed. His body lay motionless. Face down, with his arms outspread, he seemed to be floating on grey water. Only the fingertips of one hand reached into the light.
wow.
And so it begins.
That's quite an opening. So it's worth saying the opening is this death of this young man, and there is an element of the book which you could call a thriller, a whodunit, a murder mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. It begins with a death. And I know many books do, many films do. It's been said that it's a cliche to do that, and I'm aware of that. It's a trope that you can play with,
Yes,
the
it
death
reminds
of a
me
young
of
man.
Sunset Boulevard, William Holden in the swimming pool.
Absolutely, and that was a conscious point of reference. And
was it?
I might as well say, I'll admit now, you don't need to know this, but Sunset Boulevard is kind of a reference all the way through this book. Even in the title to some extent, Sunset, Violet Hour.
Yes.
And I was thinking of Joe Gillis lying on the pool at the start. I was also thinking in a more highfalutin way of Bruegel's Fall of Icarus, the boy landing on the water. But I was thinking of all sorts of thrillers where you have that death at the start. Also something like Twin Peaks, David Lynch's great series, Laura Palmer dying at the beginning. Who killed her? Will we ever find out? So I wanted there to be that kind of moment at the beginning of this, and that's what leads you into the story. We don't find out for some time who that was or what happened. There are three main characters in this novel, and he's not one of them, obviously.
So there is flashback, as it were, from that moment. So we see him as a young man, and he relates to the other characters.
You do. You get to know more about him, and you get to understand how this event and actually his life in many ways relates to those of the three main characters.
Indeed, there's a suggestion of a of a mysterious son, an adopted son, and is he that adopted son, which hangs over one of the characters in particular, believes that maybe.
Yes, that's right. There's a sort of lost child or changeling element to the story as well. That's absolutely right, and I should be careful not to give too much away.
No.
And I'm not, actually. I mean, I've said enough, but not too much there.
Yeah.
But no, that's right. His identity is part of the mystery, as much of a mystery as what happened there on the balcony, actually. But as I say, it takes a little bit of time for you to understand how that threads together with the rest of the story, because after that, if you read on, we're suddenly in New York, and we're with a man called Leo Goffman, who is a real estate mogul in his 80s, swimming in his pool, reflecting on his life, seeing a work of art in a magazine that he suddenly develops this kind of lust for and must have, and so he rings a dealer and wants to get this work of art. That dealer is a woman called Lorna, a British art dealer in her 40s. She's one of the other main characters. And the work itself is by an artist, a globally renowned abstract painter called Thomas Haller. He's the third main character. And it's really the story of how their three lives overlap and
yes,
interrelate.
And it's incredibly intriguing and a wonderful read. And art is one of the, is the binding force of the whole book. And your prose writing, which is so exquisite, is in itself so visual. You like that opening scene where you talk about the verticals and the light and the sun, things slice into into one image slices into another, water and snow and all these things you bring to life in this fantastically visual way. And it's no surprise that you have worked in the art world yourself.
Well, that's true, yeah. And I mean, for a long time, I worked in a gallery. I also worked in academia and art history and classics departments, but always working in visual art. So I guess it's no surprise that art has been my subject, but also that I've wanted in my writing to give this very kind of visual sense to everything. It's always something I've attempted to do, actually, to give it this sense of like a cinema image or a picture, a motion picture.
Indeed, and the cutting between characters is very cinematic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I want it to have that kind of heightened quality, actually. I mean, the bit I just read, this isn't the case with all of the novel, but that I did go over quite a lot to really try and get it as precise as I could. I had a very clear sense in my head of what I wanted it to look like, of how it needed to be, with the light, the angles. As I say, almost cinematic. So that was very carefully constructed in the way that I suppose. Yes, yeah. I suppose a cinematographer composes a shot. Yeah. I was thinking about it in that kind of way.
And it's funny because the opening, as you say, is like Icarus, and you mentioned Bruegel, and the Bruegel Icarus is the subject of, I think, the greatest poem ever written on the subject of art, which is W.H. Auden's Musée des Beaux-Arts. Do you know it?
Yes, of course, yeah.
And he makes, I don't know if you know that poem, it's an absolutely extraordinary poem by Auden, in which he makes the point that this astonishing sight, a boy falling out of the sky, doesn't affect anyone else in the painting. The ploughman carries on ploughing. The splash behind doesn't make him turn round. The cows carry on being cows. That the masters were very accurate about the world, that what we think is important to ordinary people going about their lives, it's unimportant. There's Icarus happening, and they're just not noticing.
Totally. He said about suffering they were never wrong, the old masters. And yes, the dog just goes on with its doggy life. And it's the sort of that absurd contrast between the pain or the horror or the tragedy of one experience and just everyday life carrying on beyond. I, weirdly enough, noticed that, I mean, as you know, I spend a lot of time now in Los Angeles, and during those dreadful fires, I was struck that week during the fires by how only a few miles away in West Hollywood, necessarily, inevitably, ordinary life carried on because it had to. Yes, people were aware of the inferno down the road, but they had to carry on with their lives. And in The Violet Hour, I think I did want to communicate some of that sort of absurdity too, the contrast between one person's suffering and another person's everyday, and the proximity of those two things. Yes. And again, not to be sort of too kind of high-flown about this, but I do think human suffering is something I'm interested in this story, what it means to suffer, to have lingering guilt or regret in your life, and how, so not just kind of big time suffering in terms of what happens there at the beginning, some kind of seismic event, but also the sort of longer term corrosive sorts of things that people have to live with.
And again, not wanting to give too much away, but Thomas Haller, the painter at the centre of this, who overlaps with other people's lives, has an erotic preference for being hurt.
He does, I'm afraid, yes.
Yeah.
As will become. But those were quite fun scenes to write.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't want.
Eye-watering.
And there's a few of them, maybe one too many, but
no, they're very, very well written.
These little interludes. But So Thomas Haller is the painter, and weirdly at the beginning, although he's had phenomenal success, he has retreated from the art world, the place that's defined him, to live in the kind of beautiful wasteland of the mountains above Lake Geneva, in this ultra-modernist house of his own creation. And his sexual escapades take place down in the town of Montreux, where he lives near. I've never actually been there, by the way.
Smoke on the water, yes.
Yes. So Montreux and Switzerland is very much the place he's escaped to. But he's a complicated man. Yes, he has this masochistic side. We don't understand. It takes a while, I think, for a reader to understand him. He's had all this success, but he's run away from it. And we come to realize that he's reached a sort of impasse, a crisis in his life. Close to the beginning of the story, he has this big comeback show in London with a big new dealer called Claude Berlin's. And it's like his return to kind of the limelight. But on the eve of this, he feels like a total fraud. Yeah. Like his whole life is a lie. And he's got this immense guilt because he's deserted his old dealer, his longtime friend, Lorna, who he was friends with, years back when they were art students together in London. He's abandoned her for this bigger, glitzier dealer, which is, not an uncommon thing, of course, in the art world. But that guilt, that regret, is part of his story. And also how he copes, for him, the costs of success, how he copes with this identity that he's cultivated.
And Claude Berlin's, we then discover, took the young artist and made him become an abstract painter and said, your future is not in figurative art, not displaying the real world, but in fields of colour. You will be an abstract. It's colour and form and tonality. That is all. Anything else, you'll just be fashionable. This will be real.
Yes, and that's exactly the way Claude speaks, in this very dogmatic way. He's a real purist, a real modernist. And in the flashback scenes, when we go back to when he first met Claude is a sort of, I think, a kind of Lord Henry, Dorian Gray figure. He sculpts the young Thomas. Yes. He determines all of his ideas, his ethos. He really kind of transforms him into the sort of celebrated abstract painter that he becomes. But as we find out, this is a rigid and to some extent a false identity that he's then kind of pushing back against. And that infatuation with Claude is an important part of the whole story, and the difficulty he has sort of breaking past that.
Now, the thing that, of course, marks out art today is that you can be admired. So you say, "Oh, I love Thomas Haller. He's my favourite painter. He's wonderful. I like him." But what makes him is the fact that there are billionaires who collect art, and they pay astounding sums of money for it. So that if you're Damien Hirst, or you're Thomas Haller, the fictional one, or you're any kind, or Gerhard Richter, who's often referenced, you become multimillionaire. You are able to command any prices you like. It's an astonishing fact about art. And those of us who most people in the world who can't afford such pictures, and also probably don't understand why they are worth so much.
Yes.
It seems astounding to us that this just up and up and up and up. But it's pure capitalism. They are worth precisely what anyone is prepared to pay for them.
Absolutely.
And people seem to be prepared to pay more than you would buy for a whole tower block.
Yeah.
For one picture.
It's astonishing.
And we meet the character Leo Goffman, who represents this. He is a property developer in New York who is a billionaire and who is passionate. To give him all his credit, he loves owning these things. And he has, you mentioned all the real artists that he has. So he has Mapplethorpe, and he has Richter, and he has, all Rothko and Picasso and any, and he collects Thomas Haller.
He does. He collects Thomas Haller very avidly. And Leo, I mean, he's a curious character. based on the sorts of people I encountered when I worked in the art business, although I always say this and people think I'm protesting too much, the characters really are not based directly on people that I worked with or knew or encountered. And they couldn't be. They couldn't be. It would be creatively limiting for me to do that. So I have to, of course you're taking little bits from people, scenarios, situations, things that happened to me at the gallery. Yes, of course you're using these things. But
and you use the real places where the season of art goes.
Oh, completely.
The Venice Biennale, the Serpentine Gallery in London.
All of that stuff. Yes, usually I've been to the places. As I said, I've never actually been to Montreux, but Google Image came in quite handy there, Street View. But to go back to Leo Goffman, you're absolutely right. I was curious there to explore what it means for somebody like that, this man in his 80s who's got everything, untold wealth, lives at the top of this sort of the pencil-thin skyscraper on the border of Central Park with an astonishing view, but lonely, surrounded by his art treasures. What does it mean for a man like that to have this desire, this insatiable desire to collect, to be defined by his art treasures? Because he has no children, and this is an interesting part of his story. And for him, buying art, owning art, is a form of consolation, I think. Consolation for the loss of his wife, who's been dead for 20 years, consolation for his immense loneliness, consolation for his own appalling personality, because he is, as you know, he's, in some ways a repugnant man, egocentric, selfish, grasping, unrepentant. He does not he says to himself at one point, "I have no regrets." Now, I'm not sure he's been quite true when he says that, quite sincere, but art for him has been a means, in some ways, of not having to face up to what a terrible man he is.
Yes, and a loss in his life.
Yes.
We'll discover later, which is important. And we know he sentimentalizes the memory of his ex-wife as well, who died.
To an almost absurd degree.
Exactly.
And actually, that pushing things to an absurd extreme is an interesting thing, because it's something I've done quite a lot in this novel. One recurring point of reference is the cinema, the films of Douglas Sirk, the mid-20th century director who, some people may be aware, made these very lush...
With Rock Hudson often and Jane Wyman.
Often. Rock Hudson seemed to be in all of them,
yes.
what I can tell. Amazing sort of lush, saturated Technicolor, extravagant music all the way through, often a sort of domestic theme, something like a middle-class woman falling in love with a man below her sort of social grade, the gardener or something like that. So a believable...
Someone going blind.
Yes, that's right.
That's one,
But they have, in the telling, in the way they're told, they have this sort of almost absurd sort of sense of excess, this heightened emotional intensity, which doesn't quite undo itself, because the feeling is still there. It's real. It reminds me a little bit of soap opera, which actually, while I was writing this, I guess it was during COVID, I got quite into Dynasty and some of those old, as they say in America, it's not Dynasty, some of those old soap operas, and I wanted an element of that to be in here.
Because Sirk also has these saturated colours, and colour is obviously, as the title of both your novels shows, very important.
Yes, people have got this idea now that it's going to be a sort of ongoing series.
Yes.
Every title will have a colour. I think I'll probably break out of this.
Your first Tiepolo Blue, and now
Yes.
Violet Hour. So I was hoping for something like, I don't know, roast beef pink.
Let's see. You might just have given me a thought there. But
No, not that. Yeah. I wonder what your view is, because the art world, in as much as I've experienced it, I happen to live right in the middle of it. I have a flat in St James's, and all around me are art galleries, and I get to know the people there and say hello, and they say, "Oh, do come along to my opening." And some of it are old masters, and some of it are very, very modern, and so on. And you kind of, it's easy to mock. There's usually some really kind of guy there who's worked there. He's, just left Eton, and are you interested in this work? Because if you give me your address, we'll send you a catalogue. And or a girl similarly from Benenden who's just gone down, and also if you are,
these were my colleagues.
Yes. If pity the... It's not often I could say this. Pity the poor, recently made billionaire tech bro who has gone to an art gallery because they're cluster around him like flies. Are you interested in this kind of thing? And they will just show him, and they'll tutor them. I mean, this is what happened in New York, isn't it? That millionaires would arrive, very often insecure millionaires.
Yes.
After the war, Jewish emigres who had made their money, wanted to connect to the world, wanted their name up as philanthropists on the boards of the big museums and theatres and so on. And they were, what should I buy? And they'd say, well, have you heard of Jasper Johns, No, tell me. And then they would go in and then they'd say, this is 2 million, and it's actually a good price for a Jasper.
Yes, this is a real deal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, and they bought it for one.
Yeah, exactly. And there've been a lot of scandals about the corruption of the auction houses and the galleries. And also, you should know that if you're a painter, what's the average percentage that you give to your gallery of the sale of a painting?
It's usually 50.
50%,
If you're doing very well, it's 60, sometimes 70. If you're a big name, you'll take as much as you want, and the gallery is still very happy. Because you look at the prices and you see why.
Yeah.
But no, it's usually 50-50. It's an insane world. It's why I wanted to write about it. And again, people sometimes think this verges on satire or caricature. Maybe. I'm not sure it does, actually. I think it's real. I think
No, it's real.
It's realist. It's the kind of world that's hard to satirize, actually, that's hard to caricature. And what you were saying about market value is very interesting and absolutely true. It feels very capricious sometimes. Why is that thing worth what it is? Well, it's because it's just developed that kind of aura. And it's got that status, and people will pay that for it. And now that people are interested, it's going up, and that's what auction prices are like. It's developed that kind of that desirability. And that's what happens until something then loses its desirability and no one understands that either, and it goes away again. But it's a very capricious world in that way. And the art market can feel like this kind of animate being, this force with its own agency that just determines taste in a way that no one can really predict. And what you say is true. In the past, certainly, rich people wanted to learn from dealers and critics and curators, what should I buy, what's important. Actually, the modern day contemporary kind of tech bro, I think it's less the case now. They don't really care. They don't want to be told. They want those gallery people just to go away and leave them alone. They'll decide if they like it. And they'll buy whatever they please. So actually, the authority of people like in the past, Leo Castelli or now Larry Gagosian, I think possibly is beginning to wane a bit because these people are just so rich and so full of it that they'll buy what they want. And
it is set against that. And I had the pleasure and honour and dubious responsibility of being a trustee of the Royal Academy for 12 years or so, and we would sort of meet and chat and everything. And the Royal Academy is interesting because it doesn't really have a collection of its own work at all. It has the schools. It is an academy where it's trained in sculpture and painting and other watercolours and architecture, but it has exhibitions coming in from all over the world. And every year, the demand got bigger and bigger for people, the crowds, whether it was a contemporary artist like Anish Kapoor, which was one of our most successful shows, but the queues were astounding. And we would say with great pride, we did press releases, more people go and look at pictures every weekend than go to football matches in Britain. It is extraordinary, just like Hay proves about books. There is an immense appetite, a need to be fed art amongst us all. It's what animates us. It's what makes life worth living. If it were just bread and protein and and if it were just water and just the things we need, life would be insupportable. It's the extras, and art is the major extra for millions of people. So despite the horrors of the art market, there is a huge appetite.
And there is, as you say, there is a place for art. And I think it's important, as I try to in this novel, to make a distinction between art and the art world, whatever that means. It's one of the questions I'm asking, or the art market, because there is a distinction. And art has an importance, it has a place. I don't think we should, particularly in a novel, try and sort of reduce that to kind of pat explanations about what art is or what it's for, as if this were a manifesto. It's not. But it reminds me of something you were saying in your talk last night, actually, about myth and the Odyssey. The fact that myth is interesting for a writer because it transports you immediately out of the particulars of the everyday, what's going on in the world today. Not always, but sometimes art can do that. Abstract art, particularly, for good reason, can do that necessarily. It takes you into a different place, mentally, psychologically, dare I say, spiritually. The art world is a different entity, a different sort of beast. And I was also interested in portraying that, of course, in this novel. It has exactly, as you say, that element of pageantry, spectacle. And there's a couple of moments in this. For example, there's this kind of big denouement scene where all of the characters end up at the Venice Biennale. Of course, how could they not? And of course, there's a kind of catastrophic lunch. Again, I won't give too much away, but they're all having one of these kind of ghastly, over-the-top last days of Rome lunches to celebrate Thomas's exhibition, and then it gets rudely interrupted. But I wanted to sort of communicate some of that pageantry. Venice is the kind of epitome of that. And Lorna, my art dealer character, is travelling to that Venice Biennale on a Vaporetto, feeling a kind of dread that she's back at this thing again and having to go through it. And she thinks, Venice has changed over the years. It used to be much more about the art, and maybe it still is to some extent, but really what people now come to see is the art world, this kind of manic consensus over taste and what matters and who matters. And that can be depressing and overwhelming. Yeah. And I think we have to always try and maintain, if we can, that distinction between art and the art world. I kind of hate, I'm using it the whole time, of course, and it appears in this phrase. I sort of hate that expression because I'm not sure it means
I know what you mean. There's also, I don't know if this is particularly a British thing. I think perhaps it is. Maybe it's universal. But there is a sense that when you stand in front of a piece of art, whether it's an old master or a modern piece, language has to close down, because if you open your mouth and talk about it, you'll sound pretentious. So when you're in an art gallery and you hear someone explaining a piece, you think, "Oh, fuck off."
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Shut up. Have you noticed how the diagonals? Oh God.
And Stephen, that person's often me.
Yeah, I know. Well, I did I only did an A-level in history of art, but I remember having to write all this guff about.
Oh yeah.
About composition and colours and morbidenza and all all these different things. But there's a good line that Thomas Haller has. I made a note of it here on my phone rather stupidly, where he says to someone interviewing him, "I try not to talk about work, even to myself. Art should speak for itself. The art I make is separate from me. It doesn't think or calculate."
Yeah, and I think he's onto something there. I mean, Thomas is a sort of tricky character. He's obfuscating a bit because there are good reasons, as the plot will reveal, why he doesn't want to talk too much about his work. And at that point, he's just been visited by this young filmmaker, this woman called Mariana Berger, who's very skeptical about him. She, in a way, is the Joe Gillis character, if we go back to Sunset Boulevard. She's gone to Norma Desmond's amazing house and is sort of fascinated by this older, more successful person. Fascinated, but also slightly repelled. Yes. But yes, he says this about his work. And as I say, he doesn't want to reveal too much. But there is also something true there, which is that I think art doesn't always need to be or shouldn't be explained. If there's that old adage, if I could have put it in words, I would have done.
Yes.
It speaks to something in you that can't easily necessarily be verbalized, which is why we're so sort of derisive about art speak and museum labels. I mean, everyone hates museum labels, and they're a sort of whipping boy because people are like, who wrote this rubbish? Or it's one person's point of view. It always.
Or the catalogue raisonné.
Well, yes,
even the fact you have to put it in French kind of alienates us. Why do you call it a catalogue raisonné?
And I mean, art speak has been, exactly. I mean, art speak, international art speak, has been the subject of a lot of parody. And I have a character in this. He's one of the more ridiculous people in the novel, a curator. He's got a super curator, this kind of globe-trotting man called Fritz Schein, who speaks this language very fluently. And there is a ridiculousnise to that.
And sometimes you hear a story. This is one that moved me enormously because he's much mocked and derided and hated by some, Damien Hirst. He did a piece, you may remember, is it The Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living? Is it the one with the piece of meat and the flies?
I think that could be the shark.
The shark.
But I know the one you mean as well.
There's one where there's a piece of meat and flies, and the flies lay their eggs in the piece of meat, and new flies are born, and they eat the meat, and it's a
they get electrocuted.
Circle, and they get electrocuted, and so they die, but then new ones are born and they die, and it's a pretty. But I heard this story from James Birch, whom you probably know.
Yes.
That Francis Bacon, the great Irish-British painter, when he was dying and knew he was dying, and this piece was on at the Royal Academy, in fact, and asked Damien and the Academy if they could close it at some point in the evening, and if he could stay with it. He wanted to engage with it. And he sat with it for, I think, 19 hours, someone said. He just sat and looked at it. And that moved me enormously, because Bacon, no one can question, was simply great. You just stood in front of one of his paintings and it was like an explosion it was like a noise in your head. You just couldn't stop being incredibly impressed by him. And the fact that he saw something and felt something in that, and Damien was of course unbelievably moved by it.
That's right. I've heard that story before, and in your head you just want to imagine what it would have been like, Bacon standing there, maybe in his sort of leather jacket,
yes, exactly,
eyeing this spectacle of death and rebirth, this really sort of grisly spectacle. And you're right. I think for Damien, that was a really important moment when he heard that had happened, and Bacon was such an important reference in his work, just in for example, in the kind of triptych format that he used.
Yes.
And Bacon, to go back to the market, is an interesting instance of this, because his paintings, those triptychs, now sell for such extraordinary amounts to, usually now a Russian oligarch of one sort or another. I remember when I was very young in my art career saying to a Bacon scholar, don't you think Francis Bacon, if he were alive today, would be horrified by these sort of spiraling prices that his paintings conjure? And he said, I think very rightly, no, I think he would have been delighted. I mean, he loved gambling, he loved chance turns of events.
I can tell you two Francis Bacon stories.
Go on.
You may know them. I mean, they're ridiculous, but they are. The second one involves me slightly, but and I've held on to it all my life. But the first one was in the 60s. He got to know Lionel Bart, who wrote Oliver, and he and his boyfriend of the time invited Lionel Bart to dinner at their house, and he was in those days. I mean, he was a big drinker and a Soho, figure, but in some ways he was quite an innocent. And Lionel Bart kept disappearing under the table and making strange snuffling noises. And when he went, Francis and his boyfriend cleaned up, and Francis said, "What's this?" He found under the table a bag of white powder, and his boyfriend said, "I think that's cocaine." And Francis said, "What do you do with it?" He said, "Well, you snort it up your nostrils." And she said, "Well, should we try?" He said, they tried. So what do you do now? He said, "Well, I think you go to a club or something like that." So they went to the reasonably newly opened Tramp in Jermyn Street, which was famous for, George Best and Terence Stamp and,
latterly Prince Andrew, I think.
And latterly Prince Andrew, exactly. They went there, and the doorman didn't know them and sort of said, "Yeah, what do you want?" And the boyfriend rather smartly said, "But we've got this." And the doorman took a bit, shoved it up his nose, and done, got them a table, bottle of champagne, then went away. And then 10 minutes later came back and said, "You two out. I never want to see you ever again." And they thought, I didn't know what was going on. And they went home and went to bed and thought, well, that was rather a disaster. Next morning, Lionel Bart calls up and says, "I think I left my dental fixative powder there." And it was his false teeth powder that he'd left behind. Anyway, that was a Francis Bacon story. It's just rather sweet to think of Bacon as being innocent. But I was at the Groucho Club, which he started to go to towards the end, because the Colony Room where he used to drink had closed down for a short time. And there was a bit of a lock-in, and Gilbert and George were there, the painters, and James Birch, fun enough. And I said, "I've got to go now," because I was filming the next day. And Gilbert and George said, "Oh, don't be an arsehole, come and stay, come on, you just have a drink." And it was like 2 a.m. I said, "No, honestly, I've got to go." And Bacon said to me, he said, "You're like me. You've got a little man, haven't you?" I said, "No, I'm single." He said, No. I mean, in your head, you've got a little man who tells you when you have to go to bed. He said, I will drink for weeks and weeks, and then the little man will say, "Francis, studio." And I'll have to go to the studio and I'll work. He said, "I knew people in the Soho who were so talented, more talented than me. They were poets, they were photographers, they were artists, but they didn't have a little man, and they're all dead."
Yeah.
He said, "Don't drown your little man. Listen to him. Listen to him."
Yeah.
And I thought that was really wonderful. Underneath all his bohemian, he had a work ethic. He knew, and he would work. And
he had extraordinary discipline. I mean, and that comes across in that magnificent biography that came out of him 4 or 5 years ago. Yes, when he was on the booze, he was really on it. But when he realised he had a show
That's
to
it,
make,
the little man spoke.
The little man was there, sort of cracking the whip. And I mean, I'm very interested in what it's like when artists are alone in their studio our great mutual friend Maggie Hambling has got a rule
to
against
whom you've dedicated the novel.
Yes, she is. That's right. Yeah, the novel I dedicated to her because it's a novel all about an artist, not an artist like her. I was quick to point out, but one thing that she will not allow, as far as I'm aware, really, is a photographer or a filmmaker to show her working. That is sacrosanct. Yes, she'll pose in front of a painting and everything else, but the moment of creation, no, she needs to be on her own, and. It's a very serious moment for Bacon or anyone. And that was something I depicted a couple of times in this, when he's just alone with his thoughts, with his memories, the past sort of welling up to haunt him and agonize him, and how are you then going to translate that into a picture or an image or a gesture? And that's quite hard to do, I think, without it sort of tipping into something... cliche or sort of romanticized. You've got to be careful not to romanticize artists, I think.
So I think we have anyone who reads the book has the right to ask you, who are your favourite contemporary artists? Who are the artists who, if they're having a show, you'll say, I've got to see it. I know we'll take Maggie as read because she's a dear friend as well. But who else?
This genuinely, I don't want to sidestep the question. It genuinely is really hard because it changes the whole time. My tastes are always changing, and in the same way as my opinions, I'm very fickle. It's bad. I don't have great fixed opinions or principles or views or anything. It's all a constantly moving feast. But you did actually just mention Gilbert and George. I've always loved their work. Yeah. They're not the most contemporary of contemporary anymore, but they've had a sort of staying power.
Haven't they?
It's popular to like Gilbert and George's early work of the 70s and 80s, which I do, and be a bit dismissive about what came after. I actually kind of like most of what they've made, including the latest stuff. Yeah. But I mean, I like a lot of what I see, from slightly younger artists. Laura Owens is an LA-based painter who is really extraordinary, someone working, I think, in a way that's pushing painting forward in a very, very exciting, dramatic way. She's someone I work with. Sarah Lucas.
Yes, gave a good review for the book, I know.
She did, yes. Yeah. She's enjoyed both my novels, actually.
Yes.
It's been wonderful. And I worked with her for a number of years, and I think she really is the probably the best artist who came out of that 1990s grouping in many ways. And she as well has sort of stayed the course. It's easy for artists, or perhaps it's inevitable that they have kind of dips. They sort of go off the boil a bit sometimes. But the work that she's been making in recent years is incredibly powerful and punchy and funny still. This is the thing. Yeah. I like it when art... I like it when any books or art has a sense of humour, and hers really does. It's important. So Sarah's work, definitely.
There was such a big moment in the 90s when Britpop emerged with Oasis and Pulp and Blur, of course, and at the same time the YBAs, as they were called, the young British artists, Damien Hirst, Sarah Lucas, Tracy Emin, Mark Quinn, a whole load of them, and they had a big show, Sensation, in 1997, I think, 8, and at the Royal Academy, and suddenly there was an explosion in a sense that whether you liked it or not, there was an energy in British art, and that seems to have flattened. Is that inevitable?
It probably is. And I mean, the art market at the moment is in a slightly kind of difficult state. Because of what's happening in the world, everyone's a bit nervous, and maybe an overdue correction is underway. Who knows? But there was that very special moment in the 90s, and I remember it. I was only a teenager, and I was a little bit young, alas, to go to Sensation. I really wish I'd gone. But I remember that there was something in the air, that feeling of energy and optimism, and amongst those artists who really just took it into their own hands to make their own exhibitions. They weren't going to wait for some gallery to give them a show. They just went and put on their own show in the Docklands, did their own thing. There were artist-run galleries like City Racing in an old betting shop in the Oval. Someone like Sarah Lucas just went and did her own show there. It was this incredible sort of formative moment. And I think you're right. I'm not sure it has quite been repeated.
There's
or
a strange new commercial level of these sort of pop-up galleries and like the modern art one on Marble Arch in London, and where they sell things that aren't quite Basquiat but look as if they're
those are
bits
terrible.
of Basquiat,
Yeah,
and Mr. Brainwash and Cause and Murakami and those sort of things.
Yes.
They're very odd, aren't they? Urban art, they call it, I suppose.
Well, that's, I think, appealing to a version of the kind of crypto bro I spoke about before, who doesn't actually care, doesn't want to know what's considered good or important. He Cause is, I'm sorry.
Yes, Kaws. They're sort of Mickey Mouse things with a cross eye.
They're sort of grotesque and awful, but they're very popular, and he does very well.
Yeah, he does extraordinarily well.
Unfortunately. But when I say unfortunately, actually, I like the one thing I like about the contemporary art world is its plurality.
Yes.
I think every kind of art has a place and is allowed to exist. I would never ban anything. So
precisely.
Well, power to him.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've got 20 minutes. We can have some questions from you if you like, about art, about books. And there's a lady here. Someone's coming around with a microphone. The lady with the lovely long silver hair. That's it. There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you were talking about your characters, you were speaking like they were real people. How do you build them? Are they people already in your head, or do you think I need this person to do this? How do you build your characters?
Thanks. I love that question because it's something I kind of wonder myself. Usually they sort of develop slowly in my head. A lot of this, and it was the same with my first novel, develops gradually in my imagination before I start writing anything down. And I don't know if you found this, but actually that's kind of my favourite bit because it sort of feels perfect at that moment, and it's all downhill in a way from that point onwards. But so they kind of build in your head, and you do begin to cultivate this sense of them as people. He would say this, or he would think this, and that's his backstory, and what did his parents do? And you begin to... Not all of that, obviously, will find its way into the novel, but it helps you make them a rounded, real person. And it's a gradual thing. You sort of live with them in your head for quite a while, to the point that, ideally, once you're writing it, and I found this with the character of Leo particularly, you hear them. I could hear his voice, this kind of...
He's the collector, the billionaire.
Yeah, the elderly... Jewish 80-something property mogul. I had a very sort of clear sense of how he sounded and the way he spoke, which probably came from films and all sorts of other experiences. Maybe partly my husband as well, who's Jewish, and that world. It came through very clearly. You do begin to hear them in a way that I think is important. Weirdly enough, I never really see them quite as clearly as I hear them. I know that some writers have a sort of absolute sense, or they even cast their characters in their head. Like, I had Matt Damon playing, my main character. I haven't ever done that. That would be too specific. So I don't know quite what they look like, although I might give some attributes, But I do like their voice to begin to come through over time.
Very good. Yes, there you are. Got the microphone.
So my question is... My litmus test for art is how truthful it is. So we're flesh computers encased in a bony skull, and the most important thing to us is what's happening in other fleshy computers encased in other bony skulls. And the best way of understanding that is through art and what that other brainy, fleshy computer creates for us. And that works very well for understanding or having an angle into appreciating or grading art when it's verbal, when it's books particularly is an extraordinary way of learning what another human being is. And it works in theatre and cinema. When we get less verbal, like music and painting in particular, I'm not quite sure how well that works. How do I know what is a true piece of painting and what's a false piece of painting? And the thing that your book is saying and what you're talking about art is that maybe recently painting has become corrupt because people are maybe just creating something because it knows an oligarch will buy it. And that is no longer an honest piece of art. They're just simply making something for sale. So, I mean, am I...
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yes, is that... What can you respond to?
I see what you mean exactly. I think, look, a lot of it is always going to be your own personal feeling about whether something speaks to you. If you open a book, can I relate to this? And in my case, that's not as straightforward as necessarily liking characters. I'm really interested in Unlikeable, protagonists, difficult people who it can be quite hard to like, but they can't be so beyond the pale that there isn't some sort of connective thread that makes you interested in them. And Leo Goffman is a good example of that. This, as I say, this kind of, in some ways, appalling man that I hope you can't help but empathise with in the end. And there is a sort of truth about that. I also like the fact that in novels, characters do obfuscate and lie and they get muddled, but in that too there is a sort of truth.
I think the questioner was also saying that one can see that in books because there are people in them who act and speak. In a painting, how can you tell, because literally a painting is surface, how can you tell that it's authentic, not just made for the market?
That it was that there was a sincerity.
Well, is that right? Is that
or a piece of music? Yeah, I think that partly it's going to be what you know of the artist. You will bring some of your own judgment. You need to perhaps know some of the context, and part of it will also be your gut feeling. I think about it, your intuitive response at how open you are. Possibly to it. My experience actually is that by and large, it's not universally the case, but by and large, artists are not making something just to flip it and make money. Damien Hirst, I'm not the first person to say this, didn't begin doing what he was doing and actually didn't continue what he was doing because it was going to make him fabulously rich. I mean, the work later became complicated because it was about wealth, it was about success. And all of those things, but actually, certainly in his case, I don't think there was this sense. And a lot of people disagree with me here. I don't think there was a sense of like, I'm just going to churn it out now to make lots of money.
I think also one of the revealing things about Damien is what an extraordinary buyer of other people's art he is, how extraordinarily supportive he is. And from the very beginning, when he was arranging as a goldsmith student these exhibitions, it was his enthusiasm for the work other people were doing. And
absolutely.
His taste and his eye for other people's
He's done
talent.
it from the very beginning.
Yes.
And I think collecting, I can't separate the collecting from his art project as a whole. It's an important part of what he does. And actually, he made a whole show in Venice about 5 years ago that was all about what it means to collect, a sort of imaginary art collection. But yeah, I mean, to be succinct, which I haven't been yet, I think a lot of it is gut, it's your gut response, but it's also probably what you know of that artist. And, are you willing to come to it with a sincere, an open heart and mind?
Sometimes there's an exhibition in Highgate in the Ivy Bequest House, Kenwood, of Sargent, the extraordinary American portraitist, they're so shallow. He was just doing it for money, and yet the way he puts paint on a canvas, you literally want to lick it. It's so extraordinarily beautiful.
It's true, and I've got to admit, I adore Sargent. But you're right. There's something gorgeously shallow about it. I was just thinking the other day, there's a wonderful portrayal of, I think it's meant to be Sargent, in Edith Wharton's The Custom of the Country. There's a painter called Claude Walsingham-Popple, this absurd man who sort of just paints everybody, and everyone wants to be painted by Claude. And yes, you feel that with Sargent too. But again, to take it back to this, surface has its own kind of power and meaning too. You don't always need to be worried about the depths.
No.
Portraiture, it's about what's up there.
I think one of the most exciting things that painting shows, which is true of all art, is what you might call an aesthetic, that there are, you can just take rather conveniently, they're both from the same part of the world and they both begin with V. You can take Vermeer, who's where you can't see a brushstroke. You go right up to it. You cannot see how the paint appeared on the canvas, and they are so beautiful, so extraordinary, so real. The house in Delft, the brickwork, you stare at it and stare at it. Probably the most popular exhibition in the history of art exhibitions at the Rijksmuseum a few years ago. They had to extend it, and the letters they were getting, people offering to pay so much money to join the queue, you just think what the beauty and the serenity, the penetration of the world. And then there's another V from the same part of the world, Vincent van Gogh, where the brush is everywhere. There's even one painting where there's a grasshopper caught in the paint that's dead, that's still there, because he was just madly doing it. They are both so truthful, and yet they're utterly opposite ways of representing the truth. So there's no clue in the way it's done. It's
Yeah.
something you receive. That the honesty of Van Gogh is obvious and the honesty of Vermeer is obvious, but they both approach it. And you can say the same of actors, that there's the kind of actor who is expressionist and there's the kind of actor who disappears, isn't present, and with writers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we all sort of roll our eyes a bit talking about my truth, this is my truth, but actually there's a force to that. You know, people do have their own sense of the truth, artists, and you see that reflected in the sheer difference between what they make.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was. Did someone else got a question there? I beg your pardon. Yeah.
Hi. Even in the greatest art galleries, Royal Academy, Rijksmuseum, occasionally I just want to stand in front of a painting and shout out loud, "It's rubbish." Now, thankfully I've never done it, but I mean, even in the temptation, am I being a cultural philistine, or is that okay?
I think it's fine.
It's more than okay. One of the great attributes of the miraculously wonderful Alan Bennett is he's a marvellous writer on painting, actually, and he and Rupert go and see paintings all the time. And he said, I do think that what they should have written on top of the National Gallery is, you don't have to like everything. And he's absolutely right.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think it's healthy, and you're allowed to change your mind as well. You might think, God, I used to hate that, but actually now I don't know. I'm 10 years older or something, and it speaks to me in a new way. So I think it's fine. And I'm always reminded of E.M. Forster wrote an essay about touring round. Again, I think it was the National Gallery with Roger Fry.
Roger Fry talked. Yes,
and Roger Fry being so sort of eloquent and knowledgeable and saying this and that about the paintings, and E.M. Forster thinking, oh God, I find it quite hard to look at these. I'm not sure what I'm meant to think. I sort of get a kind of brain Forster doesn't say this, but he paraphrasing, he says, I get a kind of brain freeze looking at these slabs of kind of paint on the wall. What am I meant to think? I think that's completely fine. And I also think it's fine sometimes. Charles Saatchi once said, when other people, he was talking about not everyone likes contemporary art, he said, it's fine. If you don't like it, that's okay too. You know, Saatchi saying it, I don't like opera. You know, you don't need to. There are some things that you don't necessarily get, or that you don't need to. I think it's fine within a gallery to object to something or just think, no, that's not for me.
Yeah. Oh, two over there.
Hi. So kind of in the same vein, I was wondering, like, there's a lot of pretentiousness or pretension around the art world, and how do you navigate that as someone writing about it and as someone who is in it?
With difficulty. Because if you're existing in it, you can't. I think it's hard to be in a state of mind where you're constantly sort of ironizing and satirizing and resenting it. Because how could you live like that? And there is, believe it or not, sincerity and meaning within the art world. A lot of the people working in there have great belief in what they do, and the art is the thing that redeems it for all of us working in that world. You know, and working with incredible artists, as I was saying before. So there's a balance actually. There are real saving graces to it. But yeah, that pretentiousness is there in spades and can't be ignored. And it was something I wanted to play with. And you know, there are characters in this, particularly that curator character, who just exude it. But actually, even in the end with him, I wanted him to be more complex than just a cardboard cutout. And a couple of readers have said about this novel, oh, well, you know, these characters seem like caricatures, but then in the end they take themselves quite seriously. And I think, well, good, because doesn't anyone in the end, you know, no one is just, no one, to go back to our point about surface, no one is just surface. Even the most ridiculous, absurd, pretentious people in the world have depths of experience, of memory, of whatever, that make them a person. And as a novelist, you have the ability to go between the surface and the interior, and that's a very, you know, not every medium can do that, so that's very special. But look, this novel in a way is all about navigating that pretentiousness, and I hope I've done it well, but well, you'll find out.
Oh, sorry, we get two there. There's some more hands in the front row afterwards. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, you talked a lot about the characters. To what extent do you have a plot in your mind and have to fit the characters into the plot? Or do you start with a bunch of characters and have to find the plot that fits the characters?
It's a really good question. It's a bit of both. I think, to answer it really honestly, it probably begins more with the characters and then the plot follows, because the characters, who they are, where they've been, what their lives have looked like, then determines the plot. But for me, plot is quite important as well, actually. And I wanted this novel, possibly more than my first one, to have a little bit of a thriller element to it. You know, people talk about it sometimes as a murder mystery. It's not quite that, but I wanted it to have the feeling of that, and to have that sort of propulsive element that pulls you through, and for there to be some twists and turns and things that leave you guessing, because that's the kind of thing that, if I'm honest, I really enjoy reading myself. So yes, character probably comes a little bit ahead of plot, but plot also really matters to me.
I think in your first book, you could say it was a linear, it drove forward, and this, it comes together, which makes it very
Well, I'm
exciting.
glad. Yes,
Yeah.
hopefully. Yeah, that's true. And I will say this, because there are 3 characters and a hell of a lot of settings, this was a lot more of a headache to write and to make it make sense.
I can imagine. So one right at the back. We will come to the front row as well. Yes.
Hello there. You said, so Stephen, you mentioned earlier about more people go and see art than watch football. As long as football fans are singing songs about centre-backs to the sound of Debussy, there's always room for an overlap in that Venn diagram. And with the cutting of budgets in schools for arts, the amount of Debussy we may hear may dwindle. Do you think more can be done to bring, and this is a horrible Route 1 common or garden phrase, could more to be done to bring art to the masses?
So it's a really good question, and of course, one hopes that one can enjoy football and art. It's certainly not a zero-sum game. Human beings have a capacity for the enjoyment of all kinds of things, and it's about widening it, not narrowing it into, funneling it into different things. Yes, art for the masses, as you say. I mean, it sounds like an unfortunate phrase, a sort of rather 50s phrase, the masses. But it is a good point. If, as you all do, you love books and you're curious about books and reading and perhaps also all forms of art and so on, it's something you want to share. You can't bear the idea that there are some people who are starved of it, who are not given at least the opportunity to enjoy it, for whom it is a strange, difficult, elitist, all those awful words that naturally accrue to things like art, that's not for us. You know, football is for the masses, but art is for the few, would be a terrible thing. And, you know, the fact is it's proved by the artists we have. Who's the most famous painter in Britain alive today? David Hockney, who comes from a very ordinary Bradford background, but was just blessed with the most astounding talent and personality to drive himself forward into the position he now has. It's so rare that people like that pop out, but within Leeds, there are, some wonderful things happening because of the memory of him and who he is. The British Library is opening an incredible new place in Leeds and so on. And you just have to hope that that this isn't forgotten in education, because for plenty of people for whom adding and speaking and writing is difficult, dyslexic people, neurodivergent people for whom language and therefore literature is closed. The opportunity to explore art, and whether physical, sculpture or even, artisanal things like pottery is still so important. But I don't know, what do you think about art education? You've taught
I agree.
yourself.
For me, it was going on school trips as a very young kid that was my earliest experience of art. That was so important. And I heard recently that schools nowadays are struggling a lot to do trips because of funding and organisational issues, which is really terrible, because that was the way that whole world was open to me at quite a young age. And actually, even now, when I'm going around galleries, I don't always like the interpretation that's provided to adults, but I quite enjoy overhearing what's being given to a class of kids. Maybe that's more my level secretly. And it's quite inspiring to hear sometimes, and it's always great to see. Well, usually, unless it's a very crowded gallery. But that's the important thing, I think. Those sorts of school visits are so important. And as you say, David Hockney, as a boy, a young boy, with him it was his father as well, who took them as children to the Bradford City Gallery. That was the thing that fired his imagination. It wasn't modern art, because I don't think they had much, but just looking at 19th century stuff made him think, this is what I want to do. Yeah,
and also television, I'm afraid, doesn't do arts broadcasting really at all now. I mean, even Sky Arts and BBC4 are fuller of other things. And that's because I grew up with Kenneth Clark and Robert Hughes and John Berger
Great.
doing extraordinary programs on arts and show, how to look, really, ways of seeing. It was amazing. We've probably got time for one more. There's a lady here in the front.
Hi. This leads on actually from what the last man was saying. So I'm currently studying for my master's at Central St Martin's, and you wrote about that in the book. My question is about class. So I'm one of 3 working class people on the course, and the 3 of us all work as well as do the course. I also live in Preston and study in London, so I split my week, and I have children and work and all of this. I was wondering what your take was on class within the art world, because what I've seen is a lot of my peers getting, it might just be because I'm a shit artist, but a lot of my peers, excuse me, get opportunities because their friend's dad owns a gallery, or they know this person or that person. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, after what you were just saying about David Hockney and things. A lot of women as well we can't go to PVs at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening because we've got people to make tea for and things like that. So I just wondered what your take on class and that sort of thing was.
Yeah, thank you. Well, firstly, the point about nepotism in the art world is absolutely true. It's still horribly nepotistic in so many ways. Whether it's more that than other industries, I'm not sure. It's depressing, but I suspect it's a more widespread issue than in the art world, and that may also be the case with class as well. Interestingly, in this story, I wanted Thomas to have come from a sort of lower middle class or upper working background, and it's part of what makes him feel, even at the height of his success, that to some extent he remains an outsider from this world and doesn't fully understand it. I think we're in a more difficult situation now in some ways than we used to be, as you say, with higher education and how difficult that is in terms of fees and juggling it with jobs and stuff. But we're in even since I was at university, it's much, much harder and kind of bleak in a way when one stops and thinks about the situation with higher education in the UK and internationally. And there are no easy answers to it. It's quite depressing. Plus the gender imbalance in the art world that you mentioned. Again, it was something I explored a bit in this. There are female artists in this who are thriving, but also, one in particular, Mariana, for whom breaking into this world has been hard and bitter agony. I mean, and what it means to feel like I'm, pressed up against the glass here. How do I get in? What do I have to do? And not, there are no easy answers to that. So it's a very, very difficult, sort of intractable problem. And things are being done, but not enough.
Worth remembering that whatever one thinks of the Damien Hirst, Sarah Lucas, Tracy Emin, and so on, what they did was at Goldsmiths and other, they completely ignored the gallery. They made their own gallery. They just said, we're going to find a warehouse somewhere in a completely run-down part of London that no one's ever heard of and tell people to come. And they did, and amazingly, Charles Saatchi came and saw the work and liked it and bought it, and they became what they became. But it was because they just ignored the world of St James's and Mayfair galleries and all Caroline and all those people, and they just said, this is our work. So you have to form your own network rather than realizing you can't join a network of old school ties and all those nepo babies. That you in a sense. It's your friends, your fellow artists. Just join with them and pop up and do your own thing if you can. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's find your own energy with your own group rather than trying to join the establishment, as it were. Because art should be anti-establishment anyway.
Yeah.
So good luck. So that's well, thank you all so much. Cannot recommend this book highly enough. It's three of my favourite British novelists are all quoted here as loving, well, one's American, sorry, Edmund White, Alan Hollinghurst and Patrick Gale all recommend this book, and they've all been here many times, and I know you'll enjoy it when you read it, and you'll read many more books by this wonderful man. James Cahill, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Wonderful stuff.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.